Tomorrow's Labor Day. It's a good day. Yeah. It started out, it was a day that we set aside to recognize the labor movement in the country, and we celebrate the labor movement by not working, which is great. It's the best part about the day. Unless we're in one of those unfortunate industries where the customers, for some reason, still need attention, like healthcare or something like that. So I love having Monday off. That's great. The worst part about it is it's only one day long, and then we got to go back to work. And on that day, you start thinking about, this is the end of summer. School's starting back up. I can't wear white shoes anymore, apparently, for some reason. We do that a lot, where we categorize what we can and can't do, or how we do and don't act, by what time it is or where we are. We kind of put things into these neat little time buckets. The work week, the weekend, summer vacation, winter break. We have these times, and when we enter one of those times, it influences what we wear and how we act and how we think. Like a couple weeks ago, we went to the beach. I didn't even pack pants. I didn't even pack shoes. There's no way I'm putting pants on at the beach. I'm shorts in it the whole way. I don't care how cold it is. In our normal weeks, though, we do the same thing. We act a certain way, we dress a certain way for work, and then we kick back into our more comfortable state when we get home. Those time divisions that we make influence how we think going into it. So if we know we're going to work, we have a certain mentality. If we know we're going to a concert, we have a certain mentality. That's probably a better frame of mind than rolling in on Monday morning. We also divide our time by secular and sacred time. We know that Sundays we get together here, we devote our time to God. And then we've got the rest of the week where we need to devote our time to work or whatever it is that we're doing. We set a Sunday aside for God, and then we go to work for that boss from hell all week. Not me, though. I have a great boss. We go into work with a different mindset than when we come to church. At least I do. I know I'm guilty of it sometimes. I know that I'm guilty of putting my work in the secular category and thinking that I just have to do this. I want to think about God. I want to learn. I want to get a closer relationship with Him. But I think to myself, well, I'm going to work, so that's going to have to wait. Or I just don't have an expectation that when I go to work, I'm going to learn about God, or I'm going to get closer to Him. I don't forget that I'm a Christian. I don't go hog wild, but I go in with a different mentality. I think I have different expectations. So when you go to work, do you expect to be in God's presence? Do you expect to be learning from Him? Do you expect to be hearing from Him? Do you talk to Him? Or do you say, okay, God, going to work, talk to you later, and kind of leave Him until you get home, or leave Him till the weekend, or leave Him till Sunday morning? When we interview people at my day job, one of the things we emphasize is that we like to have fun at work. I say, we spend too much time here not to have fun. We've got to have fun while we're working because we just spend too many hours here to not. What's probably more important is that I spend too many hours there to not be with God. Too many hours at work to leave God at home or not have expectation of being with Him. It's not to say that our work isn't important. It is. Without it, houses wouldn't get built, mouths wouldn't get fed, the sick wouldn't be healed, all that stuff. All the stuff we rely on for our day-to-day health and well-being, somebody had to work to do. And we play a part of that. Our work's important. Even Jesus worked. He worked for the first 30 years of His life in a traditional trade. It's what it takes for our society to continue. The work that we do is important because it affects others. If you don't do your job, somebody doesn't get what they need. Certain professions, being a mother, it's pretty easy to tell. If mothers don't do their jobs, things don't last very long. Kids are hungry pretty quick. Things fall apart. If nurses and doctors don't do their job, it's pretty quick to see the wheels come off. Some of us have a little more abstract jobs, but it's the same thing. Maybe our dominoes, we can't see how they fall if we don't do our job. But I can promise you what you do is important. It matters to somebody. They wouldn't pay you to do it if it wasn't. I'll take it one step farther and say that everything we do, everything we say, affects others and matters and is important. A few weeks ago, we read Romans 12:1. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. We talked about how God wants us to live our lives in worship of him, doing his work. So this morning I want to get a little more practical with that idea and talk about how what we do at our jobs, what we do in our weeks serving him is important, how it matters. Let's start with why we know that this is what we should do. Ephesians 6, verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Right off the bat, we're better off than some of the people that he was writing to. That said slaves. Last I checked, we're all voluntarily employed, and we have agreed to provide our labor. Even though this was written in an era when slavery was common, the concepts still apply to any other employer-employee relationship that we might have. The verse says slaves, employees should obey their bosses with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart. That last part's a tough one for a sarcastic person like me. Because I can fake it. It says we should obey them and mean it with sincerity of heart, just as we would obey Christ. The last line then says our obligation goes right up to the point that they're asking us to do something that Christ says we shouldn't do. So it says, let me go back to that verse. Obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. What that tells me is our obligation to our bosses and our employers goes right up to the point that they're asking us to do something that God says we shouldn't. And at that point, we don't have to do it anymore. Keeping on in verse 6. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one of you for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. It doesn't say that we're only supposed to try hard when they're going to notice. Only going to try hard when they're watching me. It says all the time. And it doesn't say that we should do our jobs to the extent that they deserve it. It says we should do our jobs like we're doing them for God, not people. That's a big challenge. How different would my words and my attitudes, my actions be each day if instead of working for my boss who might be on my nerves or a customer who's unreasonable, how different would it be if I was working for God? I can do the customer service thing. I'm pretty good at it. I'd be good up until the point that the phone call was over and my coworkers got to hear what I really thought. But this says as unto God, the way that we would work for God, when we think we're being watched and when we're not. With God, we know he's watching all the time. So when I hang up with that difficult customer and then proceed to just say what I wanted to say to the next guy that's in the room, it's probably not the attitude I'm supposed to have. This one's really hard for me. I can fake it. But the sincerity of heart and actually doing it with my heart and not just with my lips, not just paying lip service, that's hard for me. It's the place where the rubber meets the road. Sometimes I don't like what my boss tells me to do. Sometimes I don't like what my customers want me to do. But I need to think about working for God in those moments. And it's not just faking it, giving it lip service, and then saying how I really feel. It's getting my heart and my mind aligned with the way that I would do it if I was doing it for Christ. This verse lays out that the way we should work our jobs and live our days is the same way that we should serve Christ. Living every minute as though the boss is watching. In our Christian lives, we know that that's true. We know that God not only sees everything we do, he knows everything we're thinking. Can you imagine doing your job that way? I'm pretty far away from it. Maybe some of y'all are better at it than I am. But I'm pretty far away from my thoughts being okay for everybody to read at work. Or my actions or my attitudes being cool for the boss to see 100% of the time. Some days I just want to get by. Some days I just want to grumble through it. It's not what it's saying here. It says every day, every interaction should be as though we're working for the Lord. I said earlier that our work matters to others, and our words and actions matter and affect others. If you zoom out from this idea, zoom way back, you're a little person down there interacting with the world. You represent Christ. Not only by saying you go to church every week or putting money in the offering, but every word, every action, every interaction, every conversation. You're a walking billboard that says, this is what a Christian is. This is what Christ is like. Then if you zoom way in, into your heart, into your mind, our hearts and minds can be soft, or they can be hard. They can be angry, or they can be joyful. They can be focused on God, or they can be focused on ourselves. Each one of those thoughts, each one of those interactions builds up in our hearts and our minds until it becomes who we are. I've said here before, the minutes of our lives become the hours, become the days, become the weeks, become our lifetime. All the sum, every little thing we do adds up to become who we are at the end of our lives. So we can't build a life that's dedicated to serving Christ if all of our minutes are spent chewing out a coworker or grumbling, complaining. Unfortunately for me, several of my coworkers go here, so they know I'm preaching to myself this morning. They know that this is something that I struggle with. It's hard for me not to react with a temper, or to grumble or complain, or to take a shortcut if I know a faster way to get something done, but it's not the way my boss asked me to do it. These verses are here to encourage us, though, that God does take an interest in our work, in what we're doing, to the point that he wants us to do it as though we were doing it for him. Because we know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. Maybe your boss isn't paying you what you deserve. Maybe your customers really are the worst. But God will reward you for doing that job, doing that task, having that conversation, if you'll do it like you were doing it for him. We have an example of this in the Bible with Daniel. He was taken away to Babylon, away from his family, away from his fellow believers to a pagan society. He ended up working for King Nebuchadnezzar, and he worked his way up through the bureaucracy. Eventually, he became one of the leading officials in that Babylonian society. He was called a satrap. Even though Daniel was a believer in a pagan government, he worked that job like he was working for the Lord. Then Nebuchadnezzar died. Everything was all in flux for a little bit, and then that whole society was conquered by Darius. And again, Daniel worked for Darius like he was working for the Lord. Again, rose up into the bureaucracy, a satrap, one of the most important officers in the government. He gave it his best every step of the way, even though this was far from ideal situation. Then it got a little sticky because Darius was convinced by some of the other satraps that he ought to be the one that everybody was worshiping, not their own gods. So he convinced Darius to make a law that said, you can worship nobody but me. But Daniel was willing to do his best. He did do his best. He worked it as unto the Lord, but he wouldn't compromise his faith. So he did what he always did. He spent time praying to God, thanking him for his blessings, thanking him for his protection, asking him for help. The other satraps that convinced Darius to make this law, they caught him doing that. Daniel 6:13. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. So Darius a guy who not only didn't worship God, but could be convinced that people ought to worship him, had observed Daniel's life and his work and his faith. Darius could have been angry with Daniel and said, off with his head. But he respected him. He saw how Daniel worked. He saw how he lived, and he had to have respect for him. Today we might say that Darius could see something was different with Daniel. So we need to ask ourselves, do our coworkers, do the people at the store, does the lady down at the DMV see something different about us? Something special about us? Or are we ticked off customer number 374 of the day? Are we, grumbly employee number 3 today? Whatever it might be. You might say something like, well, Daniel is one of those next level guys. Not all of us are able to work our way up through the government and become all important like that. I'm just more average. Well, I've got good news for you. God made more average people than any other kind of person. So you're in good company. More than that, Jesus made average people his disciples. That's not a valid excuse. We've got other excuses though, right? Because Daniel worked in the palace. He was working for the king. How bad could it be? But do you remember how Daniel got there? He was captured, taken in exile, taken away from his family. He didn't want to be there. He was a victim of circumstance, just like me, just like you. It's really easy to find the circumstances that put us behind, right? If only I would do better. I would be able to serve God in my job, if. But, the boss is a jerk. These coworkers, bunch of pagans. How am I supposed to worship God there? You have an opportunity there. You have an opportunity there just like Daniel did. He didn't want to be there either. His life and his work were a witness to those that were around him. He did his very best for his master, but he never compromised on the things that actually mattered. We've got to learn, like Daniel did, to tear down the walls that we put up in our lives. I'm going to preach at me. It might not be you. I got to learn to tear down the walls in my life that separate my time into buckets. This is for God. This is for my boss. This is for my wife. This is for my kids. This is for me. I got to tear those things down and do it all for God. I'm working for God for my wife. I'm working for God for my boss. I'm working for God for my kids. I'm working for God for me. Amen. If I do that across the board, every step, every interaction, I'm going to be much happier. I'm going to be much more valuable to my boss. I'm going to be a much better husband to my wife, and I'm going to be a much better father to my kids. We've got to stop putting these walls up. I've got to stop putting those walls up and saying, well, now I'm this, now I'm that. We have to learn to trust God, trust him that he's watching over us, and do whatever it is we have to do like we're doing it for him. When the Israelites were captured by the Babylonians and when they were taken into exile, God gave them instructions on how to live where they didn't want to be. Okay? They're getting taken into exile, captured. Jeremiah 29, verse 5. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, this is the hard part, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Try to work for the prosperity of the people that are holding you captive. That's tough. Work for the boss who is unreasonable. Forgive and have a forgiving attitude to the person on the other end of the conversation that is losing their marbles for no reason, through no fault of your own. Hold your tongue. Be patient with your kids when they don't deserve it. Be patient with your spouse when they don't deserve it. Do it as unto the Lord. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. He says they should move in, set up shop, and work for the good of the place they're in. Do the best you can for the situation that you're in. That scripture there could be a whole other sermon, but I want to stop there and summarize with this. We spend all week somewhere else, doing something else. Do that thing as though you're working for God. Every action, every conversation, every attitude. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. Let's pray.